If you've ever studied Latin in school, you might know about its quite extensive case system. Is it aqua or aquam, aquarum or aquis? Every noun has all these different forms with all these different suffixes that you use in different situations, different places in the sentence, depending on what the role of the noun is. The case markings are those little suffixes. They're grammatical forms that, like in Latin, assign a certain role in a sentence to a noun. One might mark that a certain noun is the subject of a sentence, another might mark that it's an object, and yet another might mark that it has possession of a certain other noun, or is the origin of a movement. In English, we don't really have a full case system anymore, though we used to back in Old English. Nowadays, though, we just have some remnants left over in our pronouns. We say she when she is the subject, but her when the object is her. Now, these case systems may seem pretty solid and immutable, but they haven't just been that way forever. The cases that the Proto-Romans had in their Proto-Italic language were not quite the same as the ones that the Romans got. And all of Latin's descendants have case systems that are different from Latin too. If you've studied any Spanish or French in your time at school, you may know that only the personal pronouns really have case, pretty much like English. Now, it can be easy to imagine how words change meaning over time. Corn originally meant any type of grain, but has come to mean only maize, one specific type of grain, in American English, probably because that one specific type constituted the vast majority of the times Americans talked about a grain. This is what we call semantic change. But cases forming and developing is much harder to imagine. After all, they are grammatical structures rather than words with content. They're a lot more abstract. They don't seem particularly relevant to society, perhaps. So, what would make us change them, and how? How are new cases created? Well, the answer is there are a bunch of different ways. So, let's go through a couple. First off is cases from adpositions. Now, a lot of cases in the languages that have lots of cases are basically like prepositions in English. In Finnish, for instance, you have the nominative, accusative, genitive, partitive, essative, translative, inessive, elative, illative, adessive, ablative, allative, abassive, commendative, and instructive. And a lot of these are pretty much things we would use a prepositional phrase for in English. Now, imagine if English happened to have its prepositions after the word, postpositions, you could say. So instead of to the house to. Then imagine as people speak like this, they feel the postposition is really connected to the noun, and then even more connected, and even more connected, until the two eventually get reinterpreted as a single word. I gave a present friends to school at. This kind of thing has happened in, for instance, Old Lithuanian. In Old Lithuanian, a postposition meaning something like at was used after a noun, and eventually the two merged, so instead of a noun plus a postposition, you had a noun marked with a case that indicated motion towards something. Mishko, meaning forest, plus pie, meaning at, becomes mishkope, meaning towards the forest. One especially cool thing you can see here is that there are multiple parts getting piled on top of each other to form a new case. It's not just the postposition, but there's also a genitive case that's already on the noun, and those two combining is what creates the new allative case for motion towards. When the same postposition in Old Lithuanian merged with a noun in the locative case, instead, it created a new adessive case marking motion into something. So, adpositions are probably the most common way to get cases, but they're not the limit. Some languages create cases out of what were previously adjectives or adverbs. For instance, the Ossetic language, which is from the Caucasus region, has a commendative case that you use when denoting who accompanies you when you do something, sort of like the English preposition with, as in I visited Ossetia with a friend. So in Ossetic, you'd say chalarema to mean with a friend, or really friend with. And that ima morpheme, we think, came from what used to be an adverb meaning something like together or jointly. That might make intuitive sense. And indeed, it's also backed up by comparisons with cognates in related languages. If you check the ancient Iranian language Avestan, for instance, there's a word mat, which sounds pretty similar to ima, that means exactly that, together or jointly. So ascetic's commendative case evolved from an adverb. Another place that a case can evolve from is a noun. The Estonian language also has a commendative case, just like ascetic, but its commendative came from a noun, something like kansa, which originally meant something like people, society, or comrade. From there, it actually took two steps. First, it became a postposition, kas, meaning with, and then from there, it got shortened even more to just a suffix ga, used as a commendative, as in tule minuga, come with me. Originally a noun, now a case. You can even have cases coming from verbs. In the Ute language, which gave its name to the state of Utah, a verb meaning climb became a case marking position on top of something, and one meaning descend became a case marking for under. And there are, of course, far more pathways of case marker formation that you can find in other languages around the world. It's truly a diverse process. Now, a lot of these explanations make sense for those cases that are really like English prepositions, the ones that mean things like with and into and under and towards. But what about the even more abstract ones that mark things like the subject or object of a sentence, that's nominative and accusative, or the thing that possesses something else, that's the genitive? Well, one thing that can happen is instead of one of these cases coming directly from a content word like a noun or a verb, or even an adposition, it can evolve from another case. Now, this one is not really a case marking, but the Latin word de meant from, as in de facto, from the facts. And that evolved into de in Spanish today, which commonly indicates possession or association, as in un libro de hechos, a book of facts. It went from indicating the source to indicating possession or association, so there's an example of how a genitive marker was created. But you can also imagine how, say, a marker for the case indicating motion towards something could become an indirect object marker. After all, I threw the ball towards him has a very similar meaning to I threw him the ball. So there are lots of ways for cases to come about. They can come from adpositions, but they can also come from adjectives, adverbs, nouns, verbs, and, even though we didn't discuss them, demonstratives, pronouns, and articles. That's basically everything. And what's more, it's not like the paths that things follow to turn into case markers is simple by any means. A noun will turn into an adverb, which will turn into an adposition, which will become a case, which might eventually get lost altogether. Or an already existing case might split in two, or combine with another case to form something new. Language is complicated, and it's changing all the time, and that's true even for the abstract structural parts, the things that seem totally divorced from anyone's everyday speaking habits. But when you look at them over time, they're just as lively, and just as messy too. This video was heavily based on Leonid Kulikov's 2012 chapter on the evolution of case systems, as well as Bernd Heine's 2008 chapter on grammaticalization of case, both in the Oxford Handbook of Case.